All right, kids, it's my favorite time of the week, new tactics video. Let's talk about Inferno SRMs. So Inferno missiles are probably the oldest, longest standing type of non-standard munition in BattleTech. They go back to way back in the days. You know, if you read the old Grey Death Legion novels, they're talking about Inferno missiles back then. So those were kind of the first type of special munition in the game. And they have a really cool role, especially in the 30-25 period, where they're useful for, just kind of like heating up battle mechs and causing serious problems. If you heat up a mech, it creates terrible trouble. They're slowed down, easier to fire at with other things. Their weapons become less effective because they can't aim, and a lot of the time they're not going to want to shoot anyway. So heating up a mech, especially in 30-25, is a really nice thing to do. And the Inferno SRMs do that really, really well. Rules-wise, it's not rocket science, so to speak. An Inferno SRM adds 2 heat to a mech that it hits. For every SRM that arrives, there's going to be a maximum of 15 heat from external sources like this. So, if you hit with a whole bunch of Inferno missiles, you're going to increase the heat of the mech that you're targeting by 15. So what that means, for one thing, is there's no point hitting a mech with more than 8 Inferno missiles. Once you've hit with 8, you've done your job with the Infernos. Of course, you're going to have to really blast something with missiles in order to make sure that you can hit with 8. So in practice, this isn't usually a huge effect. The other thing to keep in mind about Inferno missiles, which we'll talk about in a second, is that they do really bad things to a lot of non-mech units in the game. Now I'm going to start with the basics and then get to an advanced topic that I think a lot of players need to think more about. The basic is, what do you want to have as your kind of priority targets for Inferno missiles? Well, the first one is pretty obvious. If you have a mech that has heat problems, if it doesn't have sufficient heat sinks, if it has very high heat weapons, that's a great target for your Infernos. The second one is pretty obvious once you read the Inferno rules, which is battle armor, especially heavier battle armor. Targeting light battle armor with Infernos is not that big a deal. The thing about Infernos is they ignore the armor value of the battle armor. Every 3 Infernos that hits just kills a battle suit, okay? No matter how much armor that battle suit has. So if you're fighting something like those giant Draconis Combine Kanazuchi heavy battle armor suits that have 15 armor on each of them plus the trooper, well, those guys you're definitely going to want to be shooting with Infernos, because it only takes 3 SRMs to kill one of them if you're shooting with Infernos, whereas normally it would take 8 SRMs. Now, on a related note, Infernos are really rough against regular infantry. An Inferno SRM is going to do 3 damage or kill 3 troopers ordinarily against a regular infantry platoon. That's not the biggest advantage in the world, if only because, there's a lot of things that are really bad against unarmored infantry, machine guns, flamers. But the good thing about Infernos is that they have longer range than those really short-ranged anti-infantry weapons. So if you do want to destroy some infantry at a decent range, Infernos are a great option. Also, regular armored vehicles like tanks, or even VTOLs if you can hit them, tanks, hover tanks, VTOLs, against those targets, Infernos do extra criticals. Okay, you get extra rolls on the critical chart, and your odds of causing a critical hit against the vehicle are pretty high. So it's very easy to do something like stun the crew, kill the crew, explode the ammo. So yeah, Infernos are also devastating against armored vehicles, especially if you're targeting a heavier armored vehicle that has a lot of armor, because you can kill it with Infernos without needing to punch through that armor. And then against proto-mechs, the effect is a lot like that against battle armor. Your Infernos destroy locations automatically on the proto-mechs. So again, it's not quite as bad as it is against battle armor, but if you're fighting against proto-mechs, Infernos are definitely a more efficient way to kill them than ordinary SRMs are. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's talk some more advanced Inferno strategy. Specifically, the strategy of using Infernos against battle mechs is more complicated. Typically, when you're using Infernos against mechs, you want to take a ton of Inferno ammo and a ton of regular SRM ammo. Because when you're fighting a mech with something that has that kind of Inferno or regular SRM power, you're going to create a lot of uncertainty on the behalf of the enemy mech commander. In any given turn, they're not going to know until you declare your attack whether you're using the Infernos or the regular missiles, or in what combination if you have multiple launchers. So what that means is, as long as you're going later than them with this unit in the initiative order, if you're declaring your attack later with this unit, then you're going to be able to kind of cause a lot of uncertainty on the behalf of the enemy mech warrior that's going to create serious problems for them. They might decide you're going to hold back on firing some of your weapons so that you don't get super overheated by the Infernos. Of course, if they do that, then they're playing your game because they're holding back their attacks, doing less damage to you, and it's kind of already getting you some of the effect that you're hoping for from the Infernos. And some turns they might hold back their attacks and maybe you fire the regular SRMs that turn instead. Or some turns maybe they decide, okay, I'm going to push the heat a little bit, and then you fire the Infernos and then they overheat majorly, okay? So it just creates a really tough situation for the enemy mech warrior. So the upshot of all this is that you want to be unpredictable when you're deciding when and where to use your Infernos. If you're getting ready to take a shot with SRMs and you have Infernos on board, you want the enemy, you want your adversary to be uncertain whether you're going to use the Infernos or whether you're going to use the regular SRMs. That's the ideal situation to be in. Now here's the part where I think I have something original to say. Many people, myself included, have a hard time kind of acting random or being unpredictable, right? I like to think things through logically in my head, and what that means is I usually arrive at a decision about what's the best option, and it doesn't leave much room for uncertainty. And that can be great, but the problem is that if my opponent knows that about me and they know how I think, then they can predict me a little bit better than they can predict some other people. So that creates kind of a problem for me if I'm trying to use this Inferno strategy, because it's going to be hard for me to be unpredictable. It's going to be hard for me to get into, a situation where my opponent doesn't know if I'm going to use my Infernos in any given turn. So if this is how you are, if you're like me and you have a hard time acting random or unpredictable, I suggest using what's called a mixed strategy. Okay, this is a term from game theory. What it means is you use a random decision process to choose one of several possible strategies. Like for example, if you were playing BattleTech and you were using a mixed strategy in some way, suppose you had a mech that was a bracket fire mech, you were trying to decide whether to use your PPCs or your medium lasers, you could roll a die to decide whether you were going to use the medium lasers or the PPCs. Now usually that's not a good idea when you're deciding between medium lasers and PPCs, but that's because, well, nobody cares if you seem unpredictable about using your medium lasers. But with Infernos, we do care about being unpredictable. And so using a mixed strategy when deciding whether to fire your Infernos, I think, can be a really effective tactic in BattleTech. It's one that I've used, and I've always felt that it really creates exactly the kind of uncertainty that you want in your opponent. And it works, by the way, whether they know that's what you're doing or not. Sometimes I even kind of roll a die in front of my opponent. Of course, I don't tell them which numbers I have mentally said are the ones that are going to go to the Inferno versus the regular missile. And you can assign the probabilities based on how good you think it would be to hit with the Infernos versus the regular missiles. Like for example, if you're in the rear arc, of the enemy mech, that's a situation where it would be good to hit with the standard SRMs because doing damage to that rear armor is really nice. But on the other hand, you don't want the enemy mech warrior to be sitting kind of confident that you're not going to use your Infernos. So maybe in that kind of a situation, I would roll a die to myself and say, well, hey, if I roll a 1, I'm going to use the Infernos in this situation. So then, there's no guarantee. They can't sit, confident and think, okay, this turn I can push the heat on my mech because I know Trailblazer's not going to use the Infernos. No, they can never be certain that I'm not going to use the Infernos. And then in a regular situation, if I'm just firing at the front arc, it's early in the game, so I don't have crits that I can hit with those missiles. Well, in that kind of a situation, I might say, okay, I'll roll, and if it comes up even, I'll fire the Infernos. If it comes up odd, I'll fire the regular SRMs. Or even if I think, oh, this would be a good situation to use the Infernos, I'll say, okay, if it's a 3 or above or it's a 2 or above, then I'll use the Infernos. But I always leave a little bit of it to chance when I've got Infernos on board, unless the target is a mech that has really good heat sinks, and so it wouldn't be that advantageous to hit them with Infernos at all. Now, Infernos are the best and most straightforward example of a situation in BattleTech where I think it's good to use a mixed strategy, but there are other situations in which it might be a nice idea, especially if you feel like your play is becoming too predictable for your opponents. So I encourage BattleTech players to just think about mixed strategies as a way to improve their game, right? Obviously, you don't want to use a mixed strategy where some of the options that you're thinking of are actively bad options, right? Like, don't roll a die and say, okay, if I roll a 1, I'm going to turn my back towards the enemy mechs or something. But in a situation where you have multiple options that seem equally good to you, or the differences between them and how good they are don't seem very big, those are the kind of situations where a mixed strategy can be really helpful as a way of kind of shaking up your play and doing something a little different and surprising your opponents. So let me know if you have other Inferno tips. Let me know if you have ways that you've used mixed strategies in BattleTech. Give me your reactions. I'm curious for your thoughts about this one, guys.